Do you want to have the confidence to truly rock retirement? Well, I'm going to show you how on the Retirement Answer Man Show. Hey, welcome to the show. My name is Roger Whitney. I am your host. I'm excited you're here. It is June, and I am in amazing Colorado, my favorite place to be in the summertime. So this month on the show, we are focused on answering your questions, listener questions. If you have a question for the show or you just want to share some feedback, you can go to rogerwhitney.com/Ask Roger and send us your thoughts. Now, although we're not doing a theme this month on the show, we are going back to that starting next month in July. In fact, July is actually a pretty big theme. It's going to be choosing your withdrawal strategy for retirement. And there's a lot of nuances to that don't really appear at first glance of how do you figure out how to withdraw money. There's some factors that you need to think about. So that's going to be all of July. And then in August, we're doing an entire month on women in retirement and some of the things we need to think about if you're a lady and you're retiring, whether you're married or not. Now, I am not a lady, and I think it's really important that we have a lady's voice when we're talking about women in retirement. So the amazing Tanya Nichols is going to join me because she is a lady and she works primarily with women near and at retirement. So that's going to be exciting for the whole month. But for this month, we're going to answer your questions and also just share some random thoughts on the retirement scene. I really believe this, that much of mainstream financial planning is really faux planning. It's not real financial planning. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's just a thing, because real financial planning, where you're walking life with someone, you understand a lot of the backstories, you're getting involved in decisions outside of the money that are invested at your particular firm, that takes time. It's not very scalable. Real financial planning generally isn't scalable, at least as of now. And what we have as a business model, especially with bigger firms, is what I call faux financial planning, where there's a lot of light financial planning talked about, but it's still about the investments. And again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's just a thing. Should is a dangerous word. I should go exercise. I should eat better. I should be nicer to my spouse or my kids. But should is a dangerous word because it implies you're not enough. It implies that you should do something, but you don't have the discipline or the will or the ability to actually do it. That's dangerous. Traditionally in retirement planning, we've thought about generating income and living off of the income. And that was definitely old school financial planning because people lived much simpler lives. Interest rates were higher. They didn't live as long. And so the idea of I just want to generate income and live off of that and not touch my money, and thinking somehow that the interest that you get or income that you get is not your money. That is not how we should think about the modern retiree. You don't think about income generation. Think about total return, where it all gets mixed together. And we're going to talk about that in July when we talk about withdrawal strategies. But income generation isn't a good strategy. Almost all of tax planning in retirement, but also in normal life, it's really not about avoidance, although you can definitely avoid and limit some taxes. A lot of times it's about timing. When do I choose to pay the tax? And in retirement, that is one of the most often overlooked levers to consider, or tactics to consider, is the timing of realizing income or capital gains and the taxes you pay. It took me a long time to realize this, but you can't actually control your emotions or your desires or your fears, or you can't control these things. We're just these crazy, imperfect human things. And if the markets go down and you're afraid, you're going to be afraid. This is fight or flight. This is what they call this, the lizard mind, something like this. You can't control your emotions. Once I realized that it's okay if I have that thought, but I get to choose whether I nurture it or let it pass by. So I've really feel much more at peace knowing that it's okay if I have these thoughts, these angry thoughts, these mean thoughts, these lustful thoughts, all these human thoughts or emotions. The key is I get the choice as to whether they drift on by me or I grab them out of the stream and I nurture them and I grow them and I obsess about them. That's where the difference is. So you can't control your emotions, but you can identify them and decide what you do with them. And that makes all the difference. We know this about life in general, but somehow we think this doesn't apply to retirement planning. And that is, life is much more complicated than getting from point A to B, right? It's not a straight line. Sometimes a new road appears out of nowhere that you decide you want to take, or a tree unexpectedly falls in your path and blocks it, and you have to navigate around it. We get that in life, but for some reason, we don't think of retirement planning that way. We think we want certainty, and it's just not that way. And that's why having an agile methodology, an agile retirement management process is so crucial, and why most normal financial planning misses the point, which is better decision making. With those random thoughts, let's get on to your listener questions. So if you have a question that you'd like answered on the show, and we do our best to try to get them all, and it's hard sometimes, you can go to rogerwhitney.com/ask Roger. All right, our first question comes from Martin on rental property. So Martin says, thanks, Roger, for all you do. You're welcome. I never hear you talk about rental property. I am about 4 years from retirement, and my wife and I own 3 rental properties that have been great investments. We paid about $100,000 10 years ago for each, and now each one's worth around $220,000. These will be paid off when I retire. Do I keep them? Do I sell them? Do I buy more when I retire? What about the tax advantages? Is this just a math problem? I really enjoy the show. I'm 58 and live in Nashville. Hey, we'll probably have a meetup in Nashville for the Rock Retirement Club. So maybe we'll tell you about that. Probably going to be August. You make a good point, Martin. We have talked about rental properties in the past, and perhaps we should make that a month-long theme because this is a big topic. I have some personal experience here, not specifically with rental houses, but with real estate in my personal portfolio. And I definitely deal with a lot of clients that have anywhere from portfolios of rental properties. They call them doors, 10, 15 doors, or own 1 or 2. So I definitely deal with this a lot. In the real estate, you came in a good time, by the way. If you came in 10 years ago, if you looked at, you put in 100, it's worth 220 today. That's about a little over an 8% return in 10 years. And it's been paying for itself. So it's not cash on cash because it sounds like you use some leverage in it. So how do these fit in to your retirement? That's part of the question, Martin, right? So let's break this down a little bit. And I don't think this is going to be comprehensive, but it'll give you a start. First off, I think you want to look at your rental properties as a business, right? It has its revenue, the payments you receive from rental properties, but it's going to have its expenses. It's going to have management expenses if you use managers. It's going to have insurance expenses, tax expenses, overhead for phones and just repairs and so forth. So I think you want to keep a separate set of books so you can look at these 3 properties as a standalone business to identify what the revenues are, what the expenses are, so you can know what your free cash flow is, which is the money that is left over after you subtract your expenses. How much is it generating in income each year after your expenses? And when you get to retirement, you could forecast what that should be when you have these paid off, right? Because you have this interest and principal expense that you have. So do that first if you haven't, Martin. That way you can think of it as a separate entity where you have this portfolio of 600, 700,000 in assets, and it's throwing off this much income. And then look at how it fits into your balance sheet, meaning on your net worth statement. What is the value of this, say, $700,000 in real estate relative to all of your other financial assets? Is it 90% of it? Is it 50% of it? It's important to know that. And that's going to really help you, one, start to look at it more strategically within the context of all of your resources. Because when you're building your retirement plan of record, Martin, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to revisit your values, dream up your needs, wants, and wishes and put costs to the cash flow on the spending side. And then the way you're going to pay for this life in retirement, which I'm assuming is the goal here, you're going to organize, okay, how am I going to pay for my life? I'm going to have my social capital, which is going to be maybe a pension or Social Security. I'm going to have human capital, which could potentially be these three properties, Martin. Maybe you have these assets where, yeah, sure, it's worth $700,000, but you can't touch that money, but it's throwing off $50,000 a year in income or whatever else it is. That's your human capital. And if you have that, it will take less pressure off of how much you need to take from your financial assets, which are 401ks, investment accounts, cash, and things like that. Then you can organize things in that way to create a plan of record. And that will help you look at creating a what if scenario. Well, what if I sold these rental properties and I received back my $700,000 investment, but now I no longer have that income source? How does that look from a fundedness level relative to keeping the properties? Now you can start to compare them side by side to help you figure out whether this is something that you want to deal with. Now, is it just a math problem? There's a lot of math there, but I think you have to go through it in the way that I structured so you can have a framework so you're not looking at individual pieces without the whole. And there is some non-math things here too. That is, I have known clients that we've navigated getting rid of rental houses. They're like, I never want to deal with that again, ever. And they even used a management company that did most of the work for a fee. So I know clients that just had no interest in it. And then I know clients that it's a major portion of their retirement strategy. And that has to do with the mental overhead that even if you have a management firm, the mental overhead, the tax complexity, the hassle factor, everybody's going to estimate those differently. So I'm trying to think of this, not so much, is it a great investment or not, Martin, as how do you start to think through it? I would say if you bought homes 10 years ago and you're looking at, I've experienced this and you've had great experience, that's my guess. I'm guessing this has been a great experience financial wise. You bought at a great time and we've had a really nice tailwind, right? Those things can change. And so I think this is how I would start thinking through it, Martin. That said, I do have in the hopper to look at making this its own standalone theme for a month so we can really explore the advantages and disadvantages of rental property. Our next question comes from Alex on retirement and a dividend strategy. Now, Alex gives me a lot of backstory, and his essential question is this: is it better to buy slower growth dividend stocks now or invest for growth for the next 10 years and convert that account to stable income dividend stocks in retirement? Well, I think the premise of your question is not accurate, Alex. You presented it, or the framework, you presented it as, do I do A or do I do B? When really, I don't know if I like either of them. I think you want to think through your investment strategy in a little bit different way. And that would be in the process, sort of like I outlined with Alex. And when you get down to your investment assets, because really when you have money, you're going to have your emergency fund, upcoming expenses reserve, pay off bad debt. Then you're looking at your investment assets. And then you're going to look at each tax category and when you think you're going to need the money. And that's going to help lead you to what allocation you have for each account. Because you may have some accounts, in our case, we talk about the pie cake, some accounts that are super long-term growth because you know you're not going to need them until you're 80, 90 years old. And they may be 100% in equities, very diversified. Whereas you may have a middle tier that has some fixed income and diversified equities. So I would go through figuring out your investments, then down to the tax category, build your pie cake and let that determine your investment allocation. The way that you've presented your question, Alex, is, do I buy dividend stocks now or do I buy them later? And then you imply that they're slower growth. Now, I do think stocks that pay dividends have value, but at least in my process, we don't focus on trying to generate gobs of income because we've built our pie cake and use more of an asset liability matching perspective. And so it's not necessarily we're trying to create lots of income in order to live off of it. And one thing when we talk about dividend stocks, that's a whole Baskin Robbins store of different things. There's more than 31 flavors. Well, maybe, I don't know. There's a lot of flavors of dividend stocks. meaning you talk about slower growth that pay better dividends. That traditionally we might call those utility stocks, right? You're never going to get rich off of utility stocks, but they consistently throw off lots of income and there's slower growth. A lot of that has changed over the years in the sense that I wouldn't think so much about dividends as companies that have healthy cash flow, because there are a lot of very fast growing companies that pay dividends and reward their shareholders in lots of different ways. So it's really about buying high quality companies that share some of the free cash flow in the form of dividends more than it is about slow growth and dividends or growth and no dividends. So I would suggest that we not focus on building dividend income per se, but in building a pie cake and making sure that your allocation matches your time horizon for the money, which is one of the biggest determinants of potential investment experience, assuming that you're well allocated. Our next question comes from Scott on IRAs and withdrawal strategies and required minimum distributions. Scott says, I'm in the pre-retirement phase of life and have been listening to your show. I'm a CPA and thought I had a pretty good financial sense, but I guess I have a lot to learn. So thanks for the great information. Thanks, Scott. So Scott says, my wife and I have learned that our required minimum distributions that come from pre-tax accounts will be more than we need to support our somewhat modest lifestyle. We are debt-free. We know we can donate more to charity or give more money to our kids with the excess money. However, we are 62 and 61 now and wondering if there are smart strategies we can implement now to reduce our retirement account balances, thus our required minimum distributions 10 years from now, when the RMD requirement kicks in. Should we increase our withdrawals over the next 10 years and pay the taxes and then put the money in savings? Any ideas would be helpful. Well, Scott, bravo for recognizing that you have this issue and you also have a time frame where there might be an opportunity. And I don't know your work situation of when you're going to retire, but here is how I would suggest you approach it. First off, I would build a very basic financial spreadsheet showing an income forecast of your expenses and your spending over the next 5 or 10 years. So how much you think you're going to spend each year, and then what income sources you're going to have each year for the next 5 or 10 years. And that's going to show you whether you have more money coming in than you're spending or so forth. But it's also going to show you what you're projecting your income is going to be each year, right? So that will help give you a sense of what income brackets you might be in. Second is, and it sounds like you've done this, but for those that haven't, you can look at your IRA accounts. And if you assume you don't touch them until you have the required minimum distribution at age 72, I would project the growth rate between now and age 72, let's say 5%, but choose what you'd like. And then you can calculate using the current tables what your required minimum distributions might be starting at age 72 and beyond. And it sounds like you did this, Scott, because you're realizing they're going to be more than you actually need. Side comment there is that we already have a proposal, I believe, in Congress where they're looking at increasing the required minimum distribution to age 75. So there's that could pass. And I've even heard conversation, there's no bill that I'm aware of that has this, of just doing away with it. So it's hard when you're doing this kind of long-term planning. But once you get those in place, Scott, now you can get an idea of what tax bracket you're going to be in, at least with the current tax code and what we're going to revert to in 2026. And then you can evaluate what you do, if anything. And generally, the two big ones are to do Roth conversions earlier than later. And like we've talked about before, taxing in this sense is really just a timing issue, right? You're going to pay taxes, or your state's going to pay taxes. You're just deciding whether you accelerate it or not. So you could look at doing Roth conversions to avoid required minimum distributions later on in life, and then prepay the tax and then just have tax-free growth forever. You could also look at withdrawing the money annually now, depending on where you fall tax brackets, and reinvesting that money in after-tax assets, or doing a gifting strategy on an annual basis up to at least the gifting limits per person. So that way you're getting money out of your estate and you're able to speak into your children's lives now, or just simply investing it. And then I think those are the two. And you decide what level you do, how much you do based on what your expected income is and what tax brackets you think you'll fall into. And then You also can, as you talked about giving right now starting at age 70, even though RMDs aren't required till age 72, from an IRA, you can do qualified charitable distributions. Currently, it's $100,000 a year. So you could factor that in there saying, okay, I'm going to do these. So if I'm going to receive $300,000 in RMDs, I know it's really only $200 to me because I'll max out the qualified charitable distributions. But I would start with that income forecast because that's going to help you understand where you might be able to accelerate some of these so you can manage your tax brackets. All right, our last question is a doozy, and it's a follow-up for another one, and it comes from Brian on advisory fees. And it's not really a doozy, but it's a fun question to think about, and it's an important question, actually. So it says, Roger, a few weeks ago, Brian says, you received a question from somebody asking about fees. That person's question was basically, why does a person with twice the portfolio value have to pay double the fees because their portfolio is twice as much, assuming an assets under management structure? You answered the question with a good explanation of the merits on how an advisor adds value. However, I'm not sure you answered the question. If they have twice the assets, why should they pay twice as much? Brian, I appreciate your follow-up on that. And that wasn't necessarily intended, but I want to make sure I answer this question as best I can. So first off, full disclosure, I am an advisor. I work with clients. I charge an asset under management structure. So as clients have more assets, the total cost does go up. In my industry, we call that talking the book. So I have a viewpoint. I have a dog in this hunt, and I'm willing to talk about it openly. And I really get your point on this, Brian. And it seems most services work this way. When you buy a house and you pay an origination fee, it's a percentage of the house value. Doesn't matter whether the house is 200 or a million. Realtor commissions work this way. If you look at asset managers like Vanguard or Fidelity, their fees or any mutual fund, the fees within the mutual fund, they don't go down as the assets go up. If you're using, say, Vanguard's CFP program, they charge a set fee. And as your assets go up, that fee doesn't go down. Now, you could argue level of extremes, but the structure is pretty normal. And so part of this, especially in the asset management world, and so a little backstory on how this fee structure came into place is initially financial advisors were more stock and investment oriented. A lot of them still are. And they were being paid for portfolio management. And that's how portfolio management is paid. It's a set fee that you pay. Let's say it's 1%. And then as the assets go up, if it's individual portfolio managers, the fee goes down on a graded scale. So advisors adopt the same structure, and the infrastructure within the industry was in place. So it was the natural progression. And so it's part of just how the industry is done, just like how Vanguard does it or Fidelity or the real estate industry. And then you get into this whole pricing discussion of why is something worth more than another thing? If you take a Timex watch, right? You can buy a Timex probably for $10, and you can buy a Rolex for $20,000. Do they keep the same value? I just flew back the other day from Florida. I flew coach, first class, cost twice as much. That's why I flew coach, because I like to fly first class when I can. I get there at the same time. There's some perks, and they get the board first, and they get hot coffee and all that other stuff. Same thing with cars. There's a smart car. Why is that worth $10,000 and a BMW can be $100,000? Who knows? So there's that value-based pricing, which is essentially you price it based on the value that you're delivering. And that would be the argument of BMW or first class airfare, et cetera, is that we're delivering a lot more value relative to the cost. And then there's what's called, at least in our industry, time-based pricing. It should be a per hour fee. And it's really the cost of producing the hour of work with some margin on top of it. Very different ways of thinking about it. So let's get to the core of your question. Is there twice as much value being added relative to the fee? The answer is going to be sometimes yes. If you think of return on investment, this is my perspective on advisor fees anyway, because I have to justify them to my clients, and I'm always willing to have open conversations about it, is the return on investment when you're paying fees for an advisor, if you're really walking life together, is asymmetric. Meaning you're probably not getting the value every single time you have the meeting, but you have behavioral coaching, you have tax awareness, you have a lot of areas where you can add value. And I think Vanguard did a study on this, and they estimated about 1% extra value if you add everything up. I don't know if that's true or not. I think we've done an episode on that in the past. What I have found personally is that the reason we do AUM is because we only want to work with clients long-term, because that allows there to be a lot of relational currency built up over time to where there's a lot of perspective and backstory. So when higher stakes decisions come about, I lost my job, I just got a package, my husband has cancer, that nobody has to get caught up. They're brought up to speed on where people have come from, why things are being done the way they are, what the priorities are of the family and the values of the family. And when those higher stakes decisions come up, everybody is aligned and they can just get to work on trying to make quality decisions. So it's very asymmetric, where there's sometimes these very high stake decisions or situations where there's a ton of value being added, and there's a ton of value being added because nobody had to get caught up to speed. Everybody already had the relational currency, so they could just trust each other and get to work. And it's difficult to do that if you don't have a relationship. And an AUM model, right or wrong, allows you, the advisor, to invest the time into the client to walk that journey, and also takes a lot of the conflicts of interest of time for money. If I call the advisor, am I going to pay a quarterly 15-minute minimum fee or what have you? Now, and sometimes, yes, in the sense that, Brian, there's more complicated life and there's more opportunities to add value. The higher the assets, the more complicated and the tax situation might be, and the more value there might be added in real dollars in thinking through how you avoid RMDs or things like that. There's value in being the project manager to think through estate planning strategies before you go to the estate attorney, or thinking through tax planning strategies before you go to the CPA. There's behavioral coaching. There's higher stakes decisions. So potentially there is a lot of value to be added if there's more assets. Sometimes, yes, and at least in our industry, is getting access to advisors that are true experts and counselors beyond simply asset management. In my experience, the best advisors, the better advisors, are turning away a lot more business than they're accepting, because they're a little bit of an outlier from normal financial advisors, and they're more seasoned. Again, this is going to be in the eye of the beholder. Now, many times, heck no, it's not worth it. We have the faux financial planning, which is advisors talking financial planning, but really just investing the assets and doing some very light calculations, using some tools and sending some reports. But they're not really willing to dive into helping you sell your business, or buy in a real estate investment property, or deal with a spending issue, allocating outside assets, helping you decide, do you refinance, pay it off, helping you figure out how much more you can spend today and still be okay later on, helping you figure out whether you can afford the lake house. They don't really dive into those, maybe on the surface, but they don't go walking hand in hand with you to be a decision-making partner, which is essentially what a great planner does. And if it's this faux financial planning, and in my experience, faux financial planning costs as much or more on an AUM basis or other whatever basis as someone who really is trying to dance for their dinner. They cost just as much or more. And then many times no, because the major business strategy for financial advisors over the last 20 years has primarily been what's called the asset gathering model. And this was promoted by the major investment firms for years. I know, I used to work at one. And that was, you go out and find the relationships, bring the money in, put them into our managed products, and we will manage the assets with our strategists and whatever. And then you manage the relationship. You talk to them, you take them to lunch, you talk about markets, you share our research, etc. That has been the predominant business model of financial advice over the last 20 years. That's not worth it. That's not worth it at all. I think the bar is a lot higher for an advisor, regardless of how they're paid, to justify their fees. And I think we're in the beginning innings of advisors dealing with that. And the biggest benefit to the advisor is the inertia of the client and not demanding more from their advisors. So I think a lot of times, perhaps the majority of time, it's not worth it. Now, I think fees will evolve. So when we talk about assets under management, and so what Brian's referring to here is say you have $1 million, the typical structure of almost all financial advisors in the advisory spaces are going to charge a percentage, say 1% a year or $10,000. And then oftentimes it's tiered or progressive, similar to tax code. You're going to pay 1%, say, on the first million, and then 90 basis points or 0.9% on the second million, and so forth. So the fee does scale down as the assets increase. And Brian, some people's fees don't scale down very much. I think ours are, scale down fairly quickly. Some scale down very quickly, so you're not really paying twice as much. It's incrementally more. And each firm, because there's no standardization, are free to set their fees any way they want. I think you have some that have AUM, but with a cap. You have flat retainer models where the advisor just charges, say, $10,000 a year. It doesn't matter whether you have $50,000 or $10 million. I'm going to charge you $10,000 a year for this set of services. You could easily in your head convert that to what the percentages of your assets, and you get back to an AUM, and advisors price it in various ways. You don't see a lot of retainer models. And then you have hourly advisors, and there are some good networks out there that will offer you hourly advice. So you just pay for the time you're using, and you're paying $100 an hour or $300 an hour. And then I do think that there's a lot of non-advice options, more than I've ever seen before. And that's part of the premise of the Rock Retirement Club, of safe places to go to get education, to get tools, to get coaching at a much lower fee, to empower you to be your own project manager or your own advisor. And I think that's a really important space, because right now in the advice industry, you have basically zero advice or somewhat expensive advice, depending on your needs, and nothing in between. So I think this is a good place to be. I do believe this is going to evolve. I'm always evolving and thinking through this, because I think it's important on my end as an advisor who charges a fee that I'm justifying why I exist and adding value. And I think that's every advisor is going to need to navigate that. But I think more importantly for you, Brian, and for others that are thinking about this, is to really think through how much advice you need and how much value potentially can be added, so you can make this evaluation for yourself. So hopefully I answered fully this question, Brian. Now let's go set a SMART sprint.
On your marks, get set.
And we're off to set a little baby step you can take in the next 7 days to not just rock life, but rock retirement. So in the next 7 days, why don't you estimate what your required minimum distributions might be? The way you do that, look at the sum total of your IRAs. And if you're married, do your spouse separately. Build a spreadsheet, put a 5% growth rate on those assets, and see what the value will be at age 72. And then we'll have a link in 6 Shots Saturday to a RMD calculator, required minimum distribution calculator, where you can run a schedule of, based on that value, the growth of assets, this is what you will have to draw out and pay taxes on. So that's your sprint if you choose to do it. Thanks so much for listening to the show. Hey, would you do me a favor? If you really enjoy the show, would you go to iTunes or whatever service you use to download or listen to the episodes and leave a review? And an honest review, of course. But the reason I'm asking is because by you doing that, it really does help bring more people to the show. And the more people we have asking questions and interacting, the more we're all going to be able to walk life and rock retirement. I hope you have a great day. Hey, it's time for that all-important disclaimer. We so appreciate you listening to the show and love your questions and love the teaching that we're able to provide here. And actually, it helps us too. But remember, you're not our clients.
Not love it if you took advice from us on the show.
We would not love it if you took advice from us on the show. Realize this is helpful in education. Talk to your legal advisor, your tax advisor, or your financial advisor before you make any decisions.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of Retirement Answer Man. Be sure to visit rogerwhitney.com/answers to access the Retirement Answer Library with over 30 checklists to help you make the most of the only life you have. Remember, you have more power than you realize to create an amazing life starting today with Retirement Answer Man. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Have a wonderful day.